I stood in my sister's kitchen the day before my bar exam results came in, and she handed me a glass of wine with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry," she said, patting my hand like I was 12 years old again. "Even if it doesn't work out, there are plenty of paralegal positions that pay decently." I hadn't asked for her opinion. I hadn't even brought up the exam. But that was Maya, always finding the crack in the wall before the paint had even dried. She had married wealthy at 26, moved into a house with a heated driveway, and somewhere between the second vacation home and the third designer bag, she had decided that her life was the measuring stick against which everyone else's should be held. Especially mine. She smiled again, sipped her wine, and looked at me with that particular brand of pity that only someone who loves you can manufacture. The kind that wraps itself in concern so you can't quite call it cruelty. And for years, longer than I care to admit, I let it land. Before I go any further, I want to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or your country in the comments right now. And while you're there, tell me something. If your own sister had said something like that to you, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet the way I did, or would you have pushed back right there at her kitchen counter? Because looking back, I understand why I went silent. I was 27 years old and still learning that not every battle is worth the breath it costs. But I also know that silence has a shelf life. And mine eventually ran out in the most public, most consequential, and most quietly satisfying way I could have ever imagined. My name is Claire. I am 38 years old, and I am a United States District Judge in the Northern District of my state. That sentence still feels remarkable to say out loud, not because I doubt that I earned it, but because there was a period of my life, a sustained, grinding, demoralizing period, when the people who were supposed to believe in me most worked hardest to make me feel like that sentence would never belong to me. Like I was writing a story, with an ending I hadn't been assigned the right to claim. Growing up, Maya and I were close in the uncomplicated way sisters are when they're young and the world hasn't yet taught them to sort themselves into winners and runners-up. We shared a bedroom until I was 10. We stayed up past our bedtime telling each other stories in the dark, inventing characters and catastrophes and happy endings with the fearless creativity of children who don't yet know what failure costs. Our parents were both school teachers, patient, principled, quietly proud people who believed that a person's worth was measured in character and effort, and who raised us to believe the same. They gave us the same values, the same dinner table, the same love. We started identical. And then, somewhere in our 20s, we diverged in ways I don't think either of us fully understood at the time. Maya met Derek when she was 24. By 26, she was married and moving into a home with crown molding and a wine cellar and a neighborhood where the lawns looked like they had been ironed. Derek Calloway was, at that point, a rising executive in commercial real estate development, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately began calculating its power structure. He was charming when it suited him, and generous in the performative way of men who understand that generosity, deployed correctly, is simply another form of control. He had a laugh that was slightly too large for any room it entered, and he smiled with every tooth, and my sister looked at him the way people look at things they are afraid to lose before they have even fully held them. I wanted to be happy for her. I was, partially. But even at the wedding, sitting in my dusty rose bridesmaid dress with champagne going warm in my hand, I noticed the way Derek looked at the caterers. The way his eyes moved through a room and quietly ranked everyone in it. There was a particular expression he reserved for people he considered beneath him, not contemptuous exactly, more like faintly amused, as though their limitations were a private joke he was gracious enough not to tell out loud. I cataloged that expression and filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and told myself I was being uncharitable. Maybe I was, but I don't think so. The comments began the way erosion begins, imperceptibly, one grain at a time, until one day you look and the ground has shifted beneath you. The first one I remember with real clarity was at a family dinner about a year after the wedding. I mentioned that I was considering applying for a clerkship with a federal appellate judge after graduation. It was something I had worked toward deliberately, something I had wanted since my first year of law school, and I said it with the careful casualness of one who has learned not to broadcast ambition too loudly in rooms where it might not be welcomed. Maya had set her fork down, not dramatically, just gently, the way you set something down when you want your hands free to manage a difficult conversation. "Claire," she said, tilting her head slightly, "that sounds incredibly competitive. Those positions go to people at the very top of their class, don't they? Are you really in that position?" "I'm third in my class," I said. "Right," she said, "but still." Derek made a sound beside her, barely a sound, really, more like the ghost of amusement, and reached across the table for the bread basket. And the conversation moved on, and I sat there for the rest of the meal with the word, still, turning over and over in my mind like a stone in a tumbler, wondering what exactly it was supposed to mean and why it had landed so heavily. I got the clerkship. I clerked for Judge Patricia Wusu for 2 years on the Ninth Circuit, and it remains one of the most formative experiences of my professional life. She was brilliant in the way that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with depth. The kind of brilliant that makes you work harder just by being in proximity to it. I learned more about the law, about judgment, about the discipline of intellectual honesty in those 2 years than in all 3 years of law school combined. I didn't announce the clerkship at a family dinner. I mentioned it the way you mention the weather, and Maya said, "Oh, that's great," and Derek nodded without looking up from his phone, and I understood then that my milestones would never be received in that house with the weight they deserved. So I stopped offering them up for reception. I started keeping my victories close, wearing them inward, letting them do their work quietly. After the clerkship, I joined the United States Attorney's Office as a federal prosecutor. I was 26 years old, and I was terrified and completely certain this was exactly where I needed to be. The work was consuming in the way that only work you are genuinely built for can be. I took the cases that other prosecutors found unwieldy, complex financial crimes, layered conspiracies, cases that required you to live inside thousands of documents for months until you understood them better than the people who created them. I was not flashy in the courtroom. I was precise. I was methodical. I prepared with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that comes not from anxiety, but from genuine respect for what the work demands. During those years, Maya and Derek's life continued to expand in visible, Instagram-worthy ways. A bigger house. A boat that required a name and a slip fee and its own category of weekend plans. Dinners at restaurants where the lighting was designed to make everyone look wealthy. International trips with photographs taken at angles that said money quietly and persistently. And every time I appeared at a family event, there was an undertone to the way Maya spoke to me. Gentle, consistent, like background music you can't quite locate the source of that communicated, without ever quite saying it directly, that I was living a harder and smaller life than I needed to, and that this was somehow a choice I was making. "You work so much," she would say, and the way she said it made my work sound like a symptom of something, loneliness, maybe, or a failure of imagination. Like the women who had figured out life were the ones who had found the right man and the right zip code, and the rest of us were just filling the hours. And then came the comment that I still think about, the one I have turned over more times than any other. I was 31. I had ended a 2-year relationship with a man who was wonderful in every way except that he found my ambition quietly threatening, which is a particular kind of incompatibility that takes too long to name and even longer to accept. I was honest about the breakup at dinner one night, honest in the way you can only be with family, or so I believed. I said I was wondering when I would meet someone who could meet me where I was. Someone who wasn't diminished by what I had built. Maya had looked at Derek, one of those married couple transmissions that happens faster than speech. And then she had looked back at me, and her expression was one I can only describe as tender condescension, the look of someone delivering a difficult truth they believe you need but might not be ready for. "Claire," she said, "I think you might need to think carefully about what you're communicating to men. The kind of men Derek knows, successful men, men at a certain level, they're not always looking for someone who's in competition with them. They want someone who complements what they've built. Someone who isn't always," she paused, choosing her word, "intense." I looked at her for a moment. "So you're saying I should be less?" "I'm saying you should think about how you me across," she said. "That's all, Derek's friends, the men in his world, they want a certain kind of dynamic. You might be another pause out of that league, not because you're not wonderful, but because of the energy you project. I did not respond. I picked up my glass and I took a sip of wine and I looked at the centerpiece on Maya's table, an arrangement of white peonies in a crystal vase, probably cost $200, very beautiful, very deliberate, and I thought about the thing I was not saying. The thing I had been holding carefully for 11 months, waiting until it was real enough to speak. I was 31 years old, and I had been nominated for a federal district court judgeship. A sitting United States senator had put my name forward. The vetting process was exhaustive and not guaranteed, and I had told no one except my parents, because I have always believed that there are things you carry in silence until they are strong enough to stand in the light. The confirmation came through the following spring. At 32, I raised my right hand and was sworn in as a United States District Judge. My mother cried from the moment we walked into the building until well after we left it. My father held my face in both his hands and looked at me for a long time without speaking, and that silence contained everything words would have cheapened. I called Maya that evening. I told her as simply and directly as I could. There was a silence on the line, 3 full seconds, maybe 4, before she said anything. "Wow," she finally said. "Claire, I had no idea you were even being considered." "I wanted to wait until it was definite," I said. "Of course," a beat. "Derek will be surprised." She said it in a tone I couldn't entirely parse. Not quite warm, not quite cold. Somewhere in the register of a woman recalculating something she thought she had already figured out. The years on the bench were the most demanding and most clarifying of my life. A federal judgeship does something to your understanding of human nature that nothing else quite replicates. You see people at their most cornered and their most dishonest. You see the architecture of bad decisions, how they are built, brick by brick, over years, by people who have convinced themselves that the rules governing ordinary people do not apply to them. You develop a very precise radar for the particular arrogance of people who believe themselves untouchable. Not because they are evil, necessarily, but because no one who mattered has ever made them feel otherwise. I did not see Derek Calloway's case coming. I want to be clear about that. I had not been tracking his career or his business dealings. He existed in my life as background, Maya's husband, someone I exchanged pleasantries with at Thanksgiving, someone whose condescension I had long since learned to process the way you process weather. Note it, dress accordingly, do not allow it to alter your plans. But on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 years into my time on the bench, my law clerk placed a new case assignment on my desk at 8:47 in the morning. Federal securities fraud, multiple defendants, commercial real estate. I read the caption. I read the lead defendant's name. Derek Allen Calloway. I set the file down. I stood up. I walked to my window and looked at the street below for what I estimate was about 90 seconds. I was not experiencing emotion, exactly. I was processing the way a computer pauses before opening a particularly large file. Then I walked back to my desk and read every page. The government's case was substantial in the way that well-built cases are substantial. Not loud, not dramatic, just dense and coherent and very difficult to argue with. Derek's company had allegedly run a fraud scheme across 4 years and 9 separate real estate development projects, defrauding investors of $340 million through falsified property appraisals, shell company transactions designed to obscure the flow of funds, and offering documents that materially misrepresented the financial health and performance of every project involved. There were 17 co-defendants, multiple cooperating witnesses. A documentary record that ran into the hundreds of thousands of pages. I called my clerk immediately. I disclosed everything. The familial relationship, the nature of it, the length of it, the lack of any financial entanglement between myself and the defendant or my sister. I initiated the full recusal review process with complete transparency and directed that both the government and the defense be notified and given every opportunity to move for my removal from the case. Neither party filed a recusal motion. The defense team, I would later understand through publicly filed documents, had researched me thoroughly and concluded that I was a predictable quantity. A judge with a long, documented record of impartiality, no financial relationship with the defendant, and a professional history that gave them no legitimate grounds for a successful recusal motion. They calculated that a known, predictable judge was preferable to the uncertainty of whoever might replace me. Derek Calloway's lawyers decided to keep me. I presided over that case with a level of procedural precision that exceeded even my usual standard, precisely because of the relationship. Every ruling was exhaustively documented. Every evidentiary decision was grounded in explicit reasoning. I was not going to give anyone, not Derek, not his attorneys, not the press, not any future appellate court, a single legitimate foothold to question my conduct. I was going to be so unimpeachably correct that the case would become a model of how these things should be done, regardless of outcome. And I was not going to allow a guilty man to walk free, because he happened to have spent 15 years at my family's dinner table. The trial ran 11 weeks. It was one of the most complex fraud cases I had presided over, and I had presided over several. The government's evidence was meticulous and layered. Wire transfers traced through 4 separate countries, internal emails in which Derek and his co-conspirators discussed with remarkable candor the mechanics of keeping investors misled, and a former CFO of one of the shell companies who had entered into a cooperation agreement and testified for 9 days with a composure and consistency that the defense's cross-examination never meaningfully dented. Derek sat at the defense table in suits that probably cost more than most of the jurors made in a month. He was composed throughout, controlled in the particular way of men who have learned that composure is a form of power, that if you project certainty with sufficient conviction, the world will often doubt itself before it doubts you. He had built his entire professional identity on this principle. It had served him very well for a very long time. I watched him from the bench with the detached neutrality my position required. And occasionally, in the private space behind my judicial composure, I thought about a specific memory, the sound he had made, barely a sound at all, when I said I was third in my class. That fractional exhalation of amusement. And then I set it aside, because it had no legitimate place in my courtroom, and I did my job. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They came back with guilty verdicts on 14 of 17 counts. The sentencing hearing was 8 weeks later. It lasted most of a day. Derek's attorneys argued with skill and genuine conviction for a sentence at the low end of the guideline range, citing his history of charitable giving, his family circumstances, his lack of prior criminal history. Character witnesses spoke about his generosity, his leadership, his presence in his community. Derek himself delivered a statement that was carefully written and professionally delivered, an expression of remorse that had been calibrated to the millimeter, that hit all the correct emotional notes without ever quite achieving the texture of something genuinely felt. I have heard a great many statements of remorse from this bench. I know the difference. I listened to every word. I weighed every submission with the same care I give every sentencing. And then I sentenced Derek Allen Calloway to 19 years in federal prison, well within the applicable guideline range, proportionate to the scope and duration of the fraud and the harm inflicted on hundreds of investors who had trusted him with their financial futures. The courtroom was very still when I finished reading the sentence. The kind of still that happens when something large and irrevocable has just been said out loud. Maya called me that evening. I saw her name on my phone and I sat with it for several rings, not from reluctance exactly, but from an awareness that whatever came next would matter and I wanted to be present for it. I picked up. Claire. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, hollowed out, like a room after all the furniture has been removed. Maya. How could you do this? Not a question, a statement looking for somewhere to land. I did my job, I said, the same way I have always done it. He is my husband, Claire. I know that. You could have stepped aside. You could have recused yourself from the beginning and none of this. Maya, I kept my voice quiet, the same way I keep my voice quiet on the bench when I need the room to understand that what I am about to say is final. I disclosed the relationship fully. I gave both parties every opportunity to request my removal. His own defense team made the legal and strategic decision to keep me on the case. I followed every rule correctly. I am not going to apologize for that. The silence between us went on long enough that I could hear her breathing, shallow, effortful breaths of someone trying very hard not to come apart. Everything is go. Ni, she finally said. The house, everything we built. Derek built a fraud, I said. He made those choices consistently over 4 years to hundreds of people who trusted him. I'm not the one who took those things from you. He did, long before I ever saw his name on a case file. She didn't respond to that. After a moment, she said, I have to go, and the line went quiet. I sat in my apartment that night for a long time. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction in any clean sense. What I felt was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. A kind of weightlessness, as though something I had been carrying for years without fully acknowledging its mass had finally been set down. Not because Derek had been convicted and sentenced, but because when the moment came, the highest stakes, most scrutinized, most consequential moment of my professional life, I had been exactly who I had spent my entire adult life working to become. There had been no gap between who I was and what the moment required. And that, I realized that night, was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. Maya and I are rebuilding, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real things are built, not according to a plan, but according to what each day makes possible. There are weeks when we speak often and weeks when the distance between us is quieter than words. She is doing her own reckoning, I think, with Derek, with her choices, with the years she spent organizing her sense of self around proximity to his ambition. She said something to me recently that I have thought about many times since. She said, I think I was scared of you, not in a bad way, but I watched you becoming something and I didn't know where it left me. And instead of being proud of you, I made it smaller. I made you smaller. And I'm sorry, Claire. I'm genuinely sorry. I held that for a moment, and then I said, You're my sister, Maya. There's no league for that. She cried. I let her. We stayed on the phone together for a long time, mostly quiet, and it was the most honest conversation we'd had in nearly a decade. I was 27 years old, standing in my sister's kitchen the day before my bar exam results, being offered wine and gentle condescension by the person who was supposed to be my fiercest champion. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I smiled and I took the wine and I tucked my belief in myself somewhere safe, somewhere quiet and unreachable, and I went home and kept working. I'm glad I didn't fight that battle in that kitchen on that night. Some battles burn energy you need for something else. Some arguments, if you win them, only teach the other person to hide the thing they actually believe. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the most devastating response to someone who underestimates you is simply to live out your answer so publicly, so undeniably, so consequentially, that the universe delivers the rebuttal on your behalf. I didn't set out to preside over Derek Calloway's fraud trial. I didn't wish for it. I didn't engineer it. I simply showed up every single day for 16 years and did the work at the highest level I could reach. And life, in its strange and occasionally precise way, arranged the rest. If you take one thing from this story, I hope it's this. The people who tell you that you're out of your league are almost always describing the ceiling of their own imagination, not the limit of your potential. Don't negotiate with that. Don't shrink to accommodate it. Don't waste your best energy trying to convince people who have already decided what you are. Build anyway. Prepare anyway. Stay quiet when silence is the more powerful move, and speak when speaking is the move that counts. And trust, really trust, that the courtroom of life is long enough that your record will eventually speak so loudly that even the people who doubted you will have no choice but to sit in the gallery and listen. I still wear the same watch I bought myself the morning my judicial confirmation was announced. It isn't expensive. Simple silver face, clean hands, no flourish. I put it on every morning before I take the bench, and it brings me back to that moment. 32 years old, hand raised, voice steady, future landing exactly where I had always quietly, stubbornly, and without anyone's permission, believed it would. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, If you've ever carried your belief in yourself like something too precious to risk in a careless conversation, leave me a comment. Tell me who doubted you and whether they ever found out how wrong they were. Hit the like button if you believe in showing up, doing the work, and letting the results speak louder than anyone's opinion of you ever could. And subscribe, because there are more stories coming, real, hard-won, deeply human stories. And I want you there for every single one.